Now you are watching a still life composition arranged to do a rendering. If you watch carefully, you can see that the composition is made up of satin fabric, which is yellow in color, a silk fabric with zari, a glass jar, and some artificial flowers arranged inside the jar. The reason for having this kind of a composition is that, as you can see, there is a variety in the fabric, which is two different fabrics, namely satin and silk with zari. Then you have a glass jar which is transparent. If you observe carefully, you will also see that this glass jar has a bit of blue in it. Rendering a lot of variety will make the student understand the different kind of materials that are to be rendered, as well as the technique used to render different kinds of materials. So, a still life composition gives the patient illustrator the maximum possible variety in a composition. So this is the challenge that a fashion illustrator must undertake to hone one's rendering skills. You can watch that the illustrator has composed a picture inside the given area. This is the most important aspect as far as the illustrator is concerned, because composing a picture actually helps in the final rendering of the product. A composition must look very pleasing to the viewer. To make it very pleasing, the illustrator must make sure that the picture doesn't have any incomplete areas. The picture shouldn't include too much of negative space in the composition. Equal amount of importance has to be given to cover a maximum of the still life kept as reference. The rendering must be visually balanced and shouldn't create any disturbance to the viewer. Here you can see that the illustrator is trying to render the handle of the glass jar. You can thoroughly observe that the illustrator is applying a combination of various blue color pencils. To add darkness to this blue, the illustrator uses brown colored pencils. It can be seen here that the illustrator continuously changes the color pencils so that the colors rendered start resembling the still life kept for reference. Here you can see that the illustrator is rendering the fabric part of the composition. The illustrator has started rendering using a dark purple shade. However, it requires a lot of prior practice to ascertain which color to be used first and which is to be used later on. So here the illustrator is using only purple colored pencil to render a particular area of the composition. This particular area is actually the blue fabric along with zari that is put on display. So the illustrator has actually rendered a part of the fabric to start his illustration. Back Observe carefully the kind of color pencil strokes rendered by the illustrator. The illustrator is actually creating a lot of depth through his color penciled strokes. Here it can be seen that the illustrator is using dark shaded colors to do the outlines. The thin lines are also being edited according to the folds of the fabrics visible. If you observe carefully, you can see that the curvature is drawn, which actually resembles the kind of fold seen on the fabric kept for reference. Observe carefully how the illustrator keeps on rendering the fabric and adds depth to the portions where light is not reflected off the fabric. Here you can see that the illustrator is concentrating on the flowers kept for reference. As the flowers are artificial, it can be rendered by keen observation. Unlike real flowers, which might change position within the stipulated time. Carefully observe the illustrator's handling of the medium. After drawing the outlines, the illustrator uses dark colored pencil to draw a small outline. Now you can see the illustrator darkening the outline. Here you can see that the illustrator is moving the pencil to and fro. Now watch carefully the handling of the medium by the illustrator. If you keenly observe, you will note that only the tip of the drawing pencil touches the paper. The uniform movement of the illustrator's hand actually creates a very subtle light and shadow in the rendering. This is made as naturally close to the material kept for reference. So here you can clearly watch the kind of depth of field that is being applied by the illustrator. Carefully watch how the illustrator has created more realistic depth by adding pencil strokes at random or resembling the still life composition kept for reference. Watch carefully the quality of line rendered by the illustrator. The lines are being worked upon regularly to make the illustration look very authentic and consistent. Here you can see that the illustrator has rendered yellow color on the surface of the paper, and this yellow is also applied in a very subtle manner without overshadowing the other colors already used in the illustration. This yellow is nothing but the reflection of the satin fabric draped in the still life composition. This yellow is actually more visible on the surface of the glass jar compared to the other materials in the rendering. Here you can see that the illustrator has used a kind of red shadow or reflection on the glass jar. But on close inspection, you might notice that there is a dark folding in the fabric kept for reference. Watch in the video towards the right hand side of the rendering. That red that is applied actually is depth, which resembles the dark purple shadows already rendered. So from a distance it looks as if the shadowed parts are aligned purposely. If you watch here properly, you will notice that the illustrator is actually rendering the neck portion of the glass jar kept for reference. If you see the kind of reflections on the glass jar, you can easily observe the play of light and shadow on the neck portion of the jar and compare it with the body portion of the glass jar. The neck portion has a lot of reflections compressed inside a small area, while the body portion of the jar has all the same reflections except that it's distributed on a wider surface. Here the illustrator is rendering the yellow colored flowers along with a very subtle light and shadow. Here, the illustrator can be seen rendering the leaves arranged in the still life composition. You can see that after applying a darker green, the illustrator is rendering a lighter tint to differentiate the colors visible on the leaf part of the still life. See the interplay of various colors on the surface of the leaves. Now the illustrator is applying a darker green to define the outlines of the leaf. The illustrator not only renders the outline but also fills the space between the outlines to render a picture that is as close to the composition kept for reference. Kindly observe that certain areas were left blank previously, and now the illustrator has filled those blank areas with green. This helps in maintaining purity of the hue. These are small techniques that an illustrator can develop through long hours of practice. Here you can observe that the illustrator is using a red colored pencil to show the kind of surface that's visible on the glass jar. Here you must keenly observe that the illustrator did not draw continuous outlines. If continuous lines are rendered, the glass jar might look very artificial in quality. The illustrator has keenly observed the glass jar, the composition, and drawn broken lines to render a realistic glass jar. If you observe the still life composition, you will notice that the glass is of course reflecting a bit of red, which is actually the red border visible on the silk fabric. Now the illustrator is actually adding a bit of intricate details to the rendering. Here you can state that the illustrator has thoroughly observed the glass jar that is kept for reference. You must watch the small shapes or details drawn by the illustrator. These are the main criteria which will overall define the glass jar kept for reference. Here you can observe the yellow colored flowers being rendered by the fashion illustrator. If you watch there carefully, you will find that the illustrator has rendered different petals that are visible in the still life composition. Watch carefully how the illustrator adds yellow color to the illustration. You can see that a bit of depth is added by using red color. The shadow appears more orangish and more natural. Now you can see that the illustrator is adding the stem portion of the rendering. Here you will have to keenly observe that the illustrator is adding darkness step by step and not by using a single stroke. So that's the difference between a good rendering and a mediocre rendering. You can see that the illustrator has added a dark red color to the rendering. The dark red is added to the yellow flowers that are rendered earlier. This dark red, when viewed along with the yellow, might look more orange than red. So one must thoroughly be aware of the pigment theory of colors so that you can put the theory to use as and when possible to help in the quality of rendering. The illustrator is now using a dark blue hue to render the next flower. Now you can see the illustrator adding blue in a very subtle manner with sharp pencil strokes. The illustrator is darkening certain areas while defining certain others with the help of blue outlines. Now the illustrator is adding red to that particular flower so that it will start looking a dark red. The combination of blue and red also makes it look more purplish rather than pure red. you can see that certain areas where red and blue are almost equal, those areas look much darker than the other areas. This happens because red mixes with blue to show you purple. So this particular rendering, if you try doing with some other colors, especially colors that will show a darker hue than the natural hue that is visible. Here you can see the illustrator mixing two colors, namely red and blue. This mixing has resulted in the formation of purple. But the point to be noted here is that that particular strip of color looks very natural and also very colorful. This kind of an effect cannot be brought about by pure hues. Watch carefully the subtle application of red and related colors. You can see that the surface of the glass reflects almost all the colors surrounding the composition. So, the illustrator has used red, orange, and yellow to capture the resemblance of the colors visible on the glass surface of the jar. Watch thoroughly the little amount of color that is applied to the surface quality of the glass jar. You can see here that the illustrator is applying a bit of blue to the surface of the glass jar. The illustrator did not apply too much of pressure on the blue pencil to create very dark rendering, but rather has done a very subtle rendering by adding very little color to the surface of the paper. If you can see carefully, you will find that there is blue, red, and yellow along with purple in this part of the rendering. The purple that is being applied right now actually creates a lot of depth in the rendering. Along with brown, the darkness keeps on increasing. Now you can see that brown is being added to the glass jar. This brown is not only about the darkness in the rendering, but it is also about the structure of the glass jar. The glass jar has a kind of stripes around the jar. This quality has to be rendered properly, or the viewer might get a different picture of the same glass jar. One must also be careful while trying to render the transparency of a material. If you watch here carefully, you can see that the stems of the flowers are inside the glass jar, and the quality of rendering where the stems are directly visible must be a little different from the rendering done for the part of the stem which is inside the glass jar. Depth must be less inside the glass jar where the stem is not visible directly. It is visible through the glass jar. So you can see the illustrator using an eraser to subdue the colors a bit so that it looks like the glass is very realistic. Now you can observe how the illustrator is rendering a bit of orange to the surface of the glass jar. The same orange is also applied outside of the glass jar so that a lot of consistency is added to the illustration. Now the illustrator also shows the fabric quality of the fabrics draped in the still life composition. You can see that within that orange rendered, you can find both darkness and lightness as realistically seen in the composition. Watch carefully how the illustrator fills a huge area stroke by stroke. Watch the uniformity of the strokes, the kind of variations introduced by the illustrator according to the still life composition. First, she applied uniform strokes. On top of these uniform strokes, she introduces variations so that the rendering quality looks more interesting as well as realistic. See how she covers the areas with rapid pencil strokes, but observe closely that these strokes contain light and shadow effects according to the still life composition kept for reference. You must also watch carefully that the corner areas are much more darker when compared to the other areas in the rendering. See how darkness is added to a particular shape so that it starts resembling the quality of the fabric drape that's arranged. So, students, note that in this particular session, you have observed a lot of varieties and rendering techniques used by fashion illustrators. You have also observed many varieties of materials and how they are to be rendered. Thank you.